Welcome to the 33rd meeting in 2012 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. If I could just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets, Blackberries, etc. Apologies for starting this formal session 6 or 7 minutes late. It's because of the pre-briefing that we actually, committee members had earlier on in terms of the Scottish rate of income tax. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether or not to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. And today we have also received apologies from Michael McMahon, who is at a funeral. Our second item of business today is to take further evidence as part of our inquiry into demographic change and the ageing population. We will take evidence in a roundtable format and can I therefore welcome to the meeting Professor David Bell of the University of Stirling, Professor David Blake of the Pensions Institute, Angela Cullen, Audit Scotland, Dave Moxham of the STUC, Claire Scott of the Lothian Pension Fund, and Dave Watson of Unison. To welcome to the committee this morning. This session will focus on the public pensions and labour force aspect of our inquiry, and I will allow up to 75 minutes for this session. If any participants want to respond to a question or make a point, please indicate to me, the clerks. Now, it's not a kind of, you're not going to be speaking in rota. If someone speaks and you feel you want to come in immediately afterwards, you know, please feel free. It's, you know, everyone, some people might come in once or twice, some people might come in half a dozen times. It's completely flexible and we want to have the session flowing. I'm actually going to ask Professor Bell to start off this morning's session. Professor Bell, comments please, and then anyone who wishes to ask a question of Professor Bell or comment more generally, please let me know.
Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about pensions, I guess. Underlying all of this, of course, is the issue of demographic change. This is not in any sense a constitutional issue. This is an issue that's hitting most of the developed world and some of the less developed world over the next 20 to 30 years. So the ratio of the population between those who are aged over pension age and those who are of, let's call it, working age from 16 to 64 is going to increase quite substantially. And I was up in Inverness and talking about this earlier in the week, and this is not an issue that's uniform across Scotland. That's one thing to make quite clear. So, for example, in 20 years' time in the Western Isles, there will be 7 people aged over 65 for every 10 that are aged between 16 and 64. So it will be a highly imbalanced population in terms of its age profile. But I guess the thing probably for today to talk about is how we can ensure that we can have a fiscally sustainable pension system that provides adequate pensions for the increasing number of people who will be beyond retirement age in Scotland over the next couple of decades, how we can do that without putting the public finances at risk, but at the same time also manage to produce a system with incentives so that young people who at the moment must be despairing about the costs of setting aside money for a pension, that in the future the system will be sustainable. And that's in the light of the fact that pension provision in the UK, at least the state pension, is not particularly generous. So and the private pensions are themselves under considerable stress for all kinds of reasons, and pension provision in Scotland is on the private side is generally a little bit weaker than is the case in the UK as a whole. So, for example, pensioner population in Scotland, at least 60% of their income comes from the state pension. and for single pensioners, particularly women, over 70% of their income comes from the state pension, which is not, as I say, terribly generous. So there are not a huge number of different pressures on our pension system, which are going to grow substantially in the future. And the difficulty for the Finance Committee is to make sure that provision can be done in a fiscally sustainable way, looking to the future. So,
And how do you think we can do that in a fiscally sustainable way, Professor?
well, the adjustments that have been made, we can get on to a discussion about life expectancy. So clearly, life expectancy has been increasing in Scotland about the same rate as in the UK as a whole. Of course, we have huge differences in life expectancy within Scotland. So there's the famous train ride, the 6 stations from Bearsden to, I've forgotten the other end of the line, but every station male life expectancy drops by 2 years. So that's the best exemplar of the inequalities that we've got. But a key issue is healthy life expectancy. And the difference between overall life expectancy and healthy life expectancy is the average that people can expect to be to have some form of chronic disease which may require regular social or medical intervention. And accepting that life expectancy will continue to increase, then preventative action, we've talked a lot about preventative spend, but finding ways to improve the healthy life expectancy of Scotland's population is extremely important, and one where our record is not good. The last time I gave evidence to the Health Committee, one of the other witnesses was pointing out that healthy life expectancy has actually been growing more slowly in Scotland, which means that this gap is increasing compared with England and Wales and Northern Ireland.
We have discussed this issue on a number of occasions, the fact that people may live an extra 7 years, for example, but 2 or 3 of those years may be spent in ill health, so clearly there will be an impact on Scottish finances as we go forward. But you talk about intervention, and indeed in Dave Watson's Unison paper there was also talk about intervention, but many of the people who will put additional will have additional need for services are already in their 40s or 50s or 60s. So intervention, I think we all agree, as a parliament in terms of early years intervention, but how do we actually touch these people? And if we cannot, what is the implication in terms of our ability to deliver good quality, effective public services going forward? Because one of the things that this inquiry is about trying to look at the service provision we will require in 10, 20 or 30 years, not through the prism of wishful thinking, but in the reality of the situation that we're actually in.
I mean, there are 3 major actors aside from the clients themselves. There's the health service, there's the formal social care provision, and there's unpaid or informal care. And, supporting carers is a big issue, and integrating the activities of the health service with the social care system is important. One of the key things here, it seems to me, is understanding whether the change fund works. Remember, 300 million has been set aside to improve the interaction of social care and the hospital service, because one of the key costs in all of this is unplanned admissions of older people into acute wards when some social care or indeed even unpaid care intervention earlier on could have prevented that unfortunate event. So there are different things going on in different parts of the country. For example, in Highland, effectively the health system has taken over caring for older people, and it's no longer the responsibility of the local authority. And what I would say from that is that we need a better way of learning around what works, because what I see when I look at the data on spend council by council, or indeed health board by health board, there seems to be a huge variation in how much is being spent, which can't be just explained by differences in the elderly population. And it isn't necessarily that well correlated with outcomes, you know, whether people are happy with the kinds of service they're getting in different parts of the country. So it seems to me that the Parliament could put pressure on the Scottish Government to make sure that lessons are learned and then rolled out to other parts of the country where things are shown to be working, and where things are shown not to be working, obviously to desist from these activities.
Everyone else is quite quiet. No one's asked to come in yet, but I'll just ask you one else while people ponder coming in. But what you're basically effectively saying is we should look at best practice across the rest of Scotland at local authority and health board level, not in terms of necessarily cost, but in terms of quality of service relating to cost, in order that we can deliver improved services as we go forward. One thing though, this issue of the unplanned emergency admissions, we've seen quotes of up to 1.5 billion. It's 13% of the NHS budget. How realisable is it, though? I mean, people talk as if that money could be nabbed for other services, but is that realistic? I mean, surely there will always be an issue of unplanned admissions, and how much of that potentially is, with better practices, could be switched to other service provision, for example?
Well, one thing that we have done quite well is to reduce delayed discharge, which is the other end of the system, quite effectively. So it is not the case that people are being kept so long in hospital just because there isn't proper provision for them at home. Actually, that's been one of the I wouldn't call it unintended, but it's possibly an intended consequence of the free personal care policy that, well, aside from that, the Scottish Government has put a lot of effort into that end of the system. I think trying to reduce the number of admissions, we're never going to reduce them to zero, but trying to understand why these are happening is the first step to at least moderating them and trying to see what interactions might have possibly been put in place that might have prevented such actions is the kind of start you've got to make. And that means that when you look at things like the Change Fund, you've got to understand, you've got to evaluate. I'm not sure that that's being done tremendously effectively. You've got to understand why it is that some interventions are successful while others may not be.
Okay, thank you. Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Dave Watson.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's very useful that Dave Watson is following, because I'm going to refer to the Unison Scotland briefing. I thought that it made a interesting and useful point at bullet point 4, where they stated whilst there's a tendency to concentrate on the negative aspects of the ageing population, Unison believes there are opportunities as well as challenges arising from the increasing number of older people, which I think is an interesting point, Convener. I wonder if Dave Watts can maybe respond to that and say what Unison believe the opportunities are, and maybe what others may say. And I just wonder if maybe, because there's nothing specific there, but later on they talk about the current trend in housing for the elderly to move away from sheltered housing as such to housing with care. This means the use of 24-hour wardens has been removed, in most cases replaced with a telecare system backed up with rapid response teams. Don't say whether they think that's a good or bad thing, but maybe that's one of the opportunities they're referring to. But so maybe they could say whether they think that's a good or a bad thing in the specific, but also in the general, also set out what these opportunities might be through an ageing population.
Thanks, Jamie. Dave to be followed by Professor Blake.
Thank you, Convener. I think the point I wanted to make in this response is that very often Scotland's ageing population is treated as all doom and gloom, and I think there is a risk that we start to demonise the elderly essentially in these circumstances, all their fault. Actually, the fact that people are living longer is a good thing for those of us addressing those ages. We might all think it's a good thing. I certainly do, but we do need to recognise that that is the case. And I think the contribution that older people make to our society and our local communities, I mean, if you take my town, you just have to look at the voluntary organisations in the town. They're largely run by retired people, and they make a huge contribution to the economy as well. We also need to recognise that obviously people are actually working later as well, for sometimes not through choice, but in other cases they are doing. So I think there's a big contribution to be made. I do accept, however, David Bell's point about the quality, what health economists call QALYs, the quality of life years, is certainly an issue, certainly in some parts of Scotland more than others. And I think, obviously, we'll come on later to talk about the fact of pensions, obviously, of life expectancy in Scotland. But certainly in terms of services, I think our concern is that that's there. I give you, I mean, it's often argued there are two big areas of avoidable spend in the Scottish budget. One is the prison population, the other is unplanned admissions to acute hospitals. And when I was an expert advisor to the Christie Commission, we looked at some of these issues in detail, particularly the unplanned admissions. And the £1.5 billion figure is there. The interesting thing is when you look at some of the data, and there hasn't been enough work, and I agree with David on this one, when you look at some of the reasons for that, there is no consistency across Scotland. We saw some statistics, some studies, for example, were done about GP admissions, and there were huge variations between GP practices and the number of people who were admitted to hospital. And when you actually looked at, you asked the people who did the study, well, what are the reasons for this? Their answer is, well, they don't know, but the only statistical correlation was the nearer the GP practice was to a hospital, the more likely you were to be admitted to that hospital. And that does not seem to me to be a particularly analytical or care-based solution to the issue. So I think there are issues. The other thing I would say is that the reasons varied enormously locally. Some local initiatives that we looked at varied considerably between area to area. And I think we should be also wary, and we've said this in our response to the Scottish Government's proposals on care integration, we should be wary about one size fits all here, because there are different solutions in different areas that meet different requirements. But essentially, I think I'd agree with Dave. I think we do need to learn from what's happening. We need to understand as to why these sorts of costs are being incurred. But I do think overall we ought to be a little bit more positive about some of the changes as well as the negatives. Sir Blake.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a comment on what Professor Bell said and then an observation. If you want fiscal sustainability with ageing populations, you have to increase the effective length of working lives substantially. Much more than is being done already. You have to make sure that young people are equipped to get into work as early as they can, and they have to be able to stay in work as long as they can, and once they reach their 60s or high 60s, they have to be encouraged to remain in work. And this is the only way in which you're going to have fiscal sustainability in this country or indeed any other country on the planet. And that requires increasing in healthy life expectancy. So the key to this is increases in healthy life expectancy, and measures should be promoted that deal with that. And then my observation is that we are ignoring, or you may not be ignoring, but I haven't heard comment upon it in the kind of notes that I've seen for these meetings, is that there's another phenomenon going on along with demographic aging across the planet, which is actually independent, but is happening at the same time, and that's globalization. And by globalization, I mean the increasing mobility of labour, capital, and products throughout the world. And we can no longer act in a bubble. The conversations up till now have been very Scottish-centric, inevitably, but we have, it's no question that if you start to raise taxes too heavily in this country, your workers will go to lower tax countries. We can see that happening in Europe. German workers, French workers, overtaxed, come to the UK where it's lower tax. So although you have the desirable requirement to increase expenditure, to increase healthy life expectancy, you will also have to take into account the globalisation factors. And I think globalisation, which, as I say, is happening independently of ageing, in many cases is going to magnify the effects of ageing. It could even speed up the effects of ageing, although in some cases it might actually ameliorate the effects of ageing in certain dimensions. But you can't ignore globalisation in this analysis.
Thank you. Interestingly, in Professor Blake's paper, it notes that about 63% of those aged 50 to 64 are in employment compared to 87% of Iceland, which, incidentally, Iceland also has the highest pension rate relative to average earnings at 115% of average earnings, whereas the UK is only 48%. Elaine, to be followed by Jean.
Really sort of in response to Professor Blake, I mean, it's very nice to think that there's this sort of ideal society where there are jobs for everybody, but in a recession there are not jobs for everybody as they get older, and you know, the young unemployed or young people coming into work. And you know, we're seeing a situation now where youngsters are on zero-hour contracts, you know, that they actually have no stable income. And I sometimes feel that the drive towards having everybody working later is just simply because employment support allowance is actually cheaper than a pension, and therefore it's cheaper to keep young people on the dole than have old people retiring earlier. So I think, you know, it would be wonderful if the world was like that, but how on earth do you have a world like that in a time of recession, a time of global recession? I think the other thing is if you have everybody working until they're 80, okay, they might be very healthy, but they're not going to be able to do all the other things that Dave was just talking about in terms of support in society, in terms of the voluntary work, in terms of, you know, maybe being involved in social enterprises, or in fact in childcare, because that's another issue, I think, where, you know, if people are not getting the support, childcare is expensive, that you will see a falling population, a falling young population, because younger people will not be having children simply because they can't afford the childcare, they can't actually afford to have many children. So we're actually going to exacerbate the situation of the demographic change if we don't get it right.
Mr. Blake, did you want to come back at some point? You don't have to
I'll come back later.
On that a wee minute. Jean, to be followed by Jamie.
Yeah, yes, well, also, we'd just like to ask Professor Blake perhaps how he reconciles some of his statements about globalization with the need for recognition for localism in terms of the differences. And we just heard that 38% of people in the Western Isles in the next 20 years are going to be over the age of 65 or retirement age. But we also have other valuable, I think, studies that are being done which show I think the Office of National Statistics that show well-being and happiness are huge contributory factors to people living longer and being content with life. And that seems not to be in the equation of globalization, and that's where people actually stay in their communities because they're happiest, and they happen to be in the areas where people live longest. So there must be a message in there that actually seems to be at odds with the thought of globalization. Not that I'm not denying that some of these things happen.
Sorry, Jamie, I'll let Jamie in just before yourself, because I think he also wants to comment.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the first question I would pose to Professor Blake, because I think it's quite a bold statement to have made that French and German workers are coming to the UK because they're overtaxed. Because I have to be honest with you, I've not been falling over all these French and German workers in my constituency. So I just wondered if we could quantify that, because I think if we were going to make a statement, there's surely can be evidence-based, but the other point I wanted to make, because I did want to ask, is, you know, I think the Pensions Institute paper's very useful and very interesting, but there was one point made, and again, I think it would be useful to have an explanation as to this, because it set out that living standards are likely to fall in some countries with fast-ageing populations, and then it goes on to say the US is likely to escape this fall. Why might that be?
Professor Blake.
Thank you very much for these comments. I'll try to deal with them in the order. Globalization isn't a choice. We can't choose whether we want globalization. This is a tsunami that's hitting us, and we're going to have to deal with it and live with the consequences of it. And I perfectly understand about the issues of localism and all the values of well-being and so on, and the benefits of that. But these things don't pay the rent, and they don't pay the taxes. And so you seem to, or the statements seem to be or give the impression that we can either choose to be part of this or not. I just don't think we can. I just don't think we can. We're going to have to accept that these forces are there, and try to deal with them and to make them as friendly to local people as we can. But I can't see how you can, like King Canute, ignore them. Coming to the question about my paper, I do live in London, and the financial services industry in London has huge numbers of German and French people who have come over here and working in London because the tax rates were too high. Were too high. They were actually could get the jobs, and they were paying lower taxes. So the London financial services industry is full of these people. They may not be coming to Scotland in the same numbers. Although I've gone to some hotels in Scotland which have got lots of very well behaved, very nice German workers in them. Glen Eagles, for example. And then the issue about growth rates. What aging populations do if they don't show the flexibilities, they will have lower growth rates. And the prediction is that, and this was a prediction from a paper from two European Union economists, that the growth rate in countries like Europe and in Japan will fall from an average of 2% per annum in real terms to 1% per annum. The US will escape this because it has much more flexible labour markets.
To be honest as well, the United States also is the only Western country with a positive birth rate at 2.1 per woman. It's actually higher than Mexico, Brazil at the moment, and it is a large number of immigrants coming in, so that also changes the kind of the picture. One thing where you talked about the number of French people in London, apparently there's some 400,000 French people in London. There's more French people than Scots now living in London. I've got a few people who want to speak now. Quite complicated in that there are 4 Davids actually among the guests today, interestingly, but thankfully 2 call themselves Dave. That makes life a little easier. So it's Claire to be followed by Gavin, then Dave Moxon.
I just wanted to comment on the issue. People are living longer, but even if they weren't, I think there has to be a recognition that the pension saving, people are not saving enough to retire, even if they were living as long as they were 10, 15 years ago. And that's partly due to the closure of private sector defined benefit pension schemes, and that's all to do with accounting and volatility that companies, don't want that risk on their balance sheets. There's a reference to the Hutton review of the public sector pension schemes in the papers, and thankfully that was one of the things that he recommended, that there wasn't a race to the bottom, as he put it, in terms of the public sector schemes are not gold-plated, and that was the impression the media gave them, and thankfully that message seems to have gone away over the last year or so, and recognition that we must keep a decent pension scheme in place for the public sector. I just want to really, the savings issue is a massive one. Very few people are saving enough. They don't recognise how much you actually do have to save to get a decent pension.
Thank you. Gavin?
A small point, Convener. I was fascinated by Dave Watson's comment that the nearer the nearer the GP practice is to the hospital, the more likely there is that the patient is admitted. I just wonder to what extent is that specific part of work in the public domain, and if it's not all publicly available, is there anything that Mr. Watson can give the committee to allow us to look at it in more depth?
I'm not sure whether it's actually been published, but it was certainly a part of a presentation that was given to the Christie Commission and influenced that report. So I think certainly if you Clark's requested it from the Social Work Directorate in the Scottish Government, then that study I'm sure is available. I haven't seen it actually published, but it's certainly available. And some of the link work about some of the schemes that were tried to address that in terms of providing funding to provide better, obviously, care and home on that basis. So I also recognise, because I missed Jamie's other question about the housing. Apologies for that. I think I'm not saying yes or no to that. I think what we do have a concern about, however, is a number of the new interventions, be it telecare, be it emergency response teams, be it self-directed care and personalisation. I think one of the concerns is that a lot of that is leading to a degree of isolation. That it's cutting out some of the socialisation aspects of care and particularly arrangements for care of elderly people. For example, we're seeing daycare centres being closed to pay for personalisation. I think there is a concern among our members in social work that what they're finding is people staying in their own home and not getting out in the way that many of the other provision, which is sometimes described as the old-fashioned care, is missing out on. And I think we should always be careful not to jump into some new idea because it's a big thing and just do that. So I think there's a role for sheltered housing with the person on site, building up a relationship with the people that live in that, as well as some of the other arrangements. So we need a variety of care, but let's not forget about isolation.
Point. Dave Moxham to be followed by Deputy Convener.
Apologies if this makes the discussion slightly scattergun, but I didn't want the last word on tax and fiscal opportunity to be left where it was there. We've heard that, and we would concede that there are competitive limitations to fiscal policy, but that's not where the United Kingdom is just now. I think there's already been information tabled to this committee that shows where the United Kingdom sits in terms of overall tax responsibility, and it certainly isn't at the top of that pile in relation to tax. It's also important to reflect that many of the countries that we heard examples of, such as Germany and France, are raising taxes precisely to deal with some of the issues that we're having to look at here, and have very many similar demographic difficulties. So I think it's very important that whilst we focus on, if you like, quality of service delivery and efficiency of delivery, and while we also take a view on the kind of inputs, how we improve the health of people who are availing themselves of services and pensions, we need to be fairly realistic about the fact that this is going to cost more money. And coming to the view that we can't afford to pay any more money because of our current fiscal position seems to me to be wrong. And therefore, what we spend has to be part of the discussion.
Okay, John, to be followed by Professor Bell.
Thanks. It was really to follow on. Claire Scott was touching on pensions, and that quite interests me. And there's a number of comments in here. The point that people are not saving enough has been made, and I think Unison made the point that increased contributions could lead to opt-out. And that makes me think, well, shouldn't it all be compulsory? Because if we all need to save more and there's a danger of people opting out, why not just take that away? So that's one question. And then I think it was from Audit Scotland, but got referred to in other papers as well, the suggestion that we need a clear statement of the aims and objectives of the public sector pension schemes. I must say I thought we were pretty clear what we were trying to do and save up for old age and things like that. But so I don't quite understand what that means. And also the suggestion that we need more experts to strengthen scrutiny and decision making, which always makes me a little bit wary. But I don't know what that means either, because having been involved in the Strathclyde Pension Fund, they had a lot of expertise there, although it was democratically controlled by councillors. But the councillors were quite limited what they could do. So I haven't seen that lack of experts, but I'm not sure what was meant by that.
Okay. Professor Bell, to be followed by Angela.
I was just going to make one simple point, which relates partly to globalisation, but just to the crisis that the general financial crisis that we're in. We've lived in a world where for 50 or so years this 2% growth rate has been an assumed constant of the universe. And we're now at a juncture where it seems to me that this can no longer be assumed. And lots of the assumptions about going forward about the costs of pensions are based on how much they cost relative to GDP. And if GDP in the short run is clearly flatlining, in the medium term and looking to the future, we don't really know. And this touches on an earlier discussion that we had. The Office of Budget Responsibility, I don't think, really knows either. But nevertheless, you know, in that context, we have to be pretty careful about the how well we organise the pension system so that it can deal with that a world where growth is much more slow than that which we've been used to in the past. And you know, for example, people are being put off saving for pensions just now because they're incredibly expensive. Because bond rates basically have been low, and until the economy really starts growing again, it's unlikely that they're going to grow significantly. So this is a particularly testing time. I agree with Dave in a sense. We shouldn't be too negative about the effects of demographic change, but there are certainly issues around things like long-term growth rate that go beyond demographic change and just hit the affordability of all public services.
Sorry about that. Angela, to be followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. I'll make a general statement, then I'll respond directly to John Mason's questions. I mean, I think there is a dilemma around pensions and fiscal sustainability. Our report that we published almost 2 years ago now, it was February 2011, so the data relates to 2009-10, identified that there was 1 million people in Scotland that had an direct interest in the 6 pension schemes, either current or future pensioners. So around 500,000 of those were people that were either already pensioners or they had stopped working and had yet to draw down their pension. And another 500,000 were current employees in the public sector. So there's 1 million people, but there are 2 different issues. Those that their pensions are protected from what they've already paid in, and those that at least a proportion of them, potentially a large proportion, the new pension reforms will affect. So there may be some ability to reduce the burden on the public sector, and the new Public Services Reform Bill that the UK Government has set out attempts to do that. So I think it's worth putting that in context, that it's 1 million people. In 2009-10, almost £3 billion were paid out to in pensions in Scotland, and public sector bodies paid in £2.2 billion into pension schemes. So it's a lot of money in the Scottish context, particularly as the economy is reducing, public sector budgets are reducing. That £2.2 billion is becoming a larger proportion of the money that's available. So it's worth putting that into context. If I can relate directly to John Mason's questions around the clear statement on objectives, that was partly in response to I think it's worth noting that a report came out in February 2011, which was between the 2 Hutton reports. So the interim report was out in September, the final report came out in March. So the level of recommendations that we could make to the government were limited because we didn't quite know what the full Hutton report was going to say. But from the work that we had done, we identified a few areas where we thought there was area for improvement. A clear statement on objectives for the pension schemes related to the fact that, from our review, 6 pension schemes in Scotland, all very different. They varied quite substantially. long history in developing those. Obviously, they reflected the different needs of the employers and the employees, and they'd been built up over time. The contribution rates varied quite substantially between the different schemes. Employers' contributions ranging from 11.5% to 25%, and employees from 1.5% to 11%. So quite a difference in the scheme. And it was our aim was to get the government to put out a statement on the aims and objectives and to clarify why there were differences, because we could see no rationale for the differences in those schemes. And the experts' point was to we appreciate there are elected members on the committees for the pension authorities, and SPPA, the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, has a big role for two of the big schemes in Scotland for teachers and NHS. And our view was, as well as non-executive or elected members, there should be some pension experts involved in those, particularly in the SPPA. That has since happened, and the government has also set up a programme board in late 2011 to respond to some of those recommendations that we made. So we are seeing that higher level strategic discussion at the Scottish Government level, although there has been a bit of a hiatus waiting for the bill to come out. I hope that answers your questions.
So just before I'll let Jamie and then Professor Blake and Dave, you know, in your submission, paragraph 27, you said, we've repeatedly warned that increased contributions will lead to greater levels of opt-out from public service pension schemes. Is that something that you've seen already? Or?
Not directly yet, because in the two main schemes, I mean, I'm the lead negotiator for most of the big public sector schemes, and I take the point that Andrew was making, which reminds me, all those negotiations, there's 1 in 5 Scots directly or indirectly affected by these schemes, and that's a big responsibility on all of us that are involved in them. I think it's important to be clear, as we make clear in evidence, that Hutton already described a declining, and I accept it, of GDP. I think David's point is valid, and that depends on GDP growing, but it is a declining share and cost on that basis. But I think it's important to emphasise that post-Hutton, that a number of further actions were taken as a result of the agreements that were reached in most of the main public service schemes in 2008-2009. And they involved increased contributions, they involved increasing, in some cases, the retirement age, the change from RPI to CPI has had a big impact on the pension schemes. You can see that if you look at the funded schemes like Clares in Lothian or Strathclyde, you can see the impacts of that on the recent valuations. So I think there have been actions. I emphasise the pension bill is not one of those. The pension bill does bring other changes, but in addition to that, we've of course got the UK government's tax grab. So they're increasing contributions has nothing whatsoever to do with pensions. This is all about essentially raising tax from pensioners to meet the UK current budget deficit. As far as the opt-out arrangement is concerned, is that there is limited data on that so far. The reason is that in the biggest scheme, which is the local government scheme, there hasn't been the contribution increases there because there wasn't the Barnett consequential, so the Treasury's tax grab didn't apply to that. So there isn't an immediate there. Although interestingly, I was at it wasn't Clare's, but one of the other pension funds. When the Chancellor made the announcement about increased contributions, very interesting. The following month, there was a big spike in the number of people who opted out of the pension scheme that month, even though there actually wasn't going to be an increase, but they clearly thought there was. So I think that's a good indication. For the health service scheme, which is the next big one, in those circumstances, the impact on the lower paid will kick in next April. So we'll be looking at the data next year to get a clearer picture on those particular changes. So I think those are factors there. I think in terms of opt-out, obviously the broader picture is that, you know, how can we get more people, the point that Claire was validly making about the getting people in the pension fund. Obviously, auto-enrolment is part of the strategy for dealing with that. Obviously, the aim is that's really aimed at the private sector where there aren't these sorts of schemes in the main. The problem with auto-enrolment is there are opt-outs from that individually, and bigger companies can opt out in various ways. The other factor with auto-enrolment is the actual payment to minimum pension schemes is well short of what the pension industry industry thinks is necessary. About a 12% contribution, and the National Association of Pension Funds and others have produced reports which I've referenced in my paper to today's committee. What we are, however, seeing, I think, even before contribution levels kick in, is that, and I see that talking to our members, particularly our lower paid members, is they're seeing their real wages cut. They're seeing the potential for increased contributions coming along. They've got other costs coming at the same time, housing costs in particular. And they're starting to say to themselves, well, you know, is pensions, if I'm in my 20s and 30s, my current priority? You know, if your costs are going up, your wages are standing still, and you're paying 6.3% on average into a pension fund, the temptation to use that as this year's pay rise and last year's pay rise is pretty high. Added to that, obviously an increasing retirement age before you get your pension. I mean, to be blunt, there are times when I've addressed large numbers of low-paid workers in the west of Scotland about pensions, and they've looked at me and made very valid points about the cost and other pensions. You do look at them when you know the life expectancy of most of the people in that room. You do wonder why they pay into a pension scheme on occasions, and some of them begin to work that out. You know, frankly, in large parts of the west of Scotland, the average life expectancy means that they will not collect that pension, and frankly neither will their dependents in terms of their spouses. Their children will, but certainly not their spouses. And this is something we made to John Hutton when he came up and did his report. He kept talking about broad averages for the UK and people, you know, life expectancy rising into the 70s, but that isn't the case for large parts of our communities, and I think that's a real issue, particularly at the lower paid end of the scale, and we need to recognise that in our pension policies and retirement age policies to recognise this. I slightly disagree with Angela about the need for standards. You know, I'm involved in negotiations for the big schemes in Scotland, local government and the health service. They are different schemes, but also the staffing groups are very different. If you look at a local government scheme, local government has a large preponderance of low-paid workers in it, half the workforce earning less than 19,000 a year, whereas the health service scheme has a much more balanced range of workers, taking account of the fact that some higher-paid groups in there as well. So I think, you know, we do need to design pension schemes, you know, to reflect the different staff groups. And that, you know, I've negotiated for 30 years in pensions in the private sector as well. And I wouldn't, all my private sector schemes I've negotiated for, they're not all the same. They reflect the different groups on that basis. So I agree about the need for consistent advice and those points, but I think schemes need to reflect the needs of the members of those individual schemes.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Professor Blake.
Thank you, Convener. I'll throw this open for general comment. I think it would be particularly useful for us to get the perspective of the Lothian Pensions Fund, the Pensions Institute, and I think probably STUC will have a perspective on the matter I'm going to raise. Clearly, pensions funds will be looking to maximise the income they can accrue to pay out as pensions at the other end. And when we were in Hoyk, we had a housing association, I think it was Eildon Housing Association, made the point that they would be looking to, they think it would be useful to try and access pension funds for the building of houses, and then pension funds could get a sustainable return on their investment. Of course, this would also have the added attraction of helping stimulate economic growth. The Scottish Government suggested they were interested in this area, so I'm wondering, are pensions funds interested in this area? Is this a good approach, and if so, is it happening, or is it likely to happen?
Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to raise some points about the last series of discussions, which was on about pensions and savings, and then end up with this the point about infrastructure. I agree absolutely with Claire. We are not saving anywhere near enough for our retirement. We talked about 1 in 5 Scottish workers have still very good public sector schemes, so that means that 4 out of 5 don't, then they're not saving anywhere near enough, taking into account these life expectancy differences. And going to the question about compulsory savings, when we have a population structure which is like a pyramid, then, in other words, with a wide base of young people and a very small number of old people, every generation passes its mistakes down to the next generation, and if you have a wide base, those mistakes are spread evenly and no one notices it. But if we have the case where we don't save enough for our retirement, then we are passing on the burden of that to the next generation. And that becomes bigger as this population pyramid becomes a column, and in some cases might become an inverted pyramid. So you're actually passing a big problem down to a smaller number of people. So intergenerational fairness and equity must be part of this calculation as well. And again, I haven't seen that. We're talking about a lot of conversation about fairness within generations and, you know, poor people, should they be expected to save for a pension or not? But that then leads to the question that John Mason raised, which is, should we have mandatory contributions? Now, if auto-enrolment fails, and even if it succeeds, the contribution rates are nowhere near adequate. We know that, as you say, 12%, and possibly with low, we might be living in a world of low long-term real returns going forward. Then 12% won't be anywhere near enough, and it could be 15 or 16%, very huge increases in savings compared with what's going on, very hard for people on low incomes to pay for, to make these contributions out of their, and reducing their real spending power. Then it's not an easy problem to solve, but then you have the issue of this intergenerational fairness, which you have to deal with as well. And most people in every generation have to pay for their own pensions. The vast majority of people within any generation must pay for their own pensions. They can't rely on anyone else. Now, the positive side of actually increasing pension savings is that you can get this virtuous circle of the pension savings going into increasing the capital stock, which increases the productivity of the workforce, which increases their income, which increases their savings, and which then increases the capital stock going forward. So the positive aspects of this are definitely to, if the savings can be productively invested, and infrastructure investment is clearly one case, then I think that is again very positive. The pension funds as a whole, and even the public sector pension funds, the local authority pension funds, are slightly wary of the political direction of investment. So there's been a major danger that there has been state confiscation of private sector pension assets, beginning in Argentina in 2000. We've scarily had Hungary confiscate private sector pension assets. It's happened in Portugal, and it's also happened in Ireland. So there are major dangers of what can happen going forward. So we need to be very careful about this. But pension funds should be investing long term. And so it's very sensible for them with the right type of infrastructure investments to engage in this. They don't like development projects, so they don't like things which are uncertain. Once the infrastructure investment's in place, then they're quite happy to invest in it because they can then see more secure returns. But they don't like the initial development stage of these projects. So if we can try and get around that, then we can start building this virtuous circle of encouraging savings. But I do think that we should consider mandatory minimum contributions for the vast majority of people, because if auto-enrolment fails, then we have another serious problem on our hands.
Okay, Angela, sorry, Claire to be followed by Angela.
Thank you. Just responding to John Mason's questions around experts and scrutiny. This was another recommendation from the Lord Hutton report about increases in governance standards, and that's built into the Public Service Pensions Bill as well. So it's still, we're waiting to see what's going to happen in Scotland as a result of those the bill recommendations. It's still going through the UK Parliament. Specifically on the local government pension scheme and scrutiny and decision making. The councillors in the pension funds are the large majority of the decision-making structures, and there are issues of continuity. So, for example, in 2007, we had a committee of 5 members, and they were all replaced, and we had a brand new committee. pensions is complicated and there's a great deal of training and education necessary. So it can cause interruptions and problems in terms of continuity. But generally, standards of governance in the local government scheme are pretty good on average, especially relative to the unfunded pension schemes. You know, we have annual reports and accounts, there's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of data available, so there's certainly a lot more scrutiny in the local government scheme compared to many on the unfunded. But Hutton's comments on governance extended to the unfunded schemes as well, not just the unfunded. Having said that, you know, the standards of governance do vary. If you're not aware, you probably should be, that there was a study done a couple of years ago around potential consolidation of the local government schemes in Scotland, and that looked at consolidating 11 down to 2, 3, maybe one fund, and that sort of ruled out. It concluded there was no evidence to do that. Now, I would suggest that you need to be clear about what your objectives are as to whether you want to consolidate or not. What are the objectives? Is it efficiency? Is it a better governance? And that's a different issue. I guess that comes down to the local control of the pension funds versus, you know, how the governance works, how much local control there is. And then coming on to Jamie Hepburn's question around local and housing association investment. With the local government pension scheme, it is governed by broader broader pensions law, and the fiduciary duty of the councillors that are making decisions on the pension fund is absolutely crucial. And this is taking their hat off when they come into the room. They're not a councillor, they come in as a quasi-trustee. They're not a trustee because it's not the scheme is not made in trust, but they have to come in and act in the best interests of the beneficiaries of the scheme. So that conflict of interest, Professor Blake made the comment, it is very important, and schemes have to really manage that very carefully. A great deal of training around that as well. So coming on to the housing association investment, yes, income is important for any investment pension fund, but it is total return, it's capital return and income, so income's not solely the driver. The conflict of interest is an issue. Again, what are the motivators behind any housing association investment or infrastructure per se? Generally, pension funds over the last few years have been increasing their infrastructure investment. It is seen as a long-term asset class, generally gives some inflation protection, which is good for the pension liabilities as well. One thing that concerns me about potential housing association investment is the local aspect of that. Funds need to be concerned about diversification, what risks are they taking, are they getting adequately paid for that investment risk, and the trustees and the internal teams and investment managers of the fund have to take an investment decision in the best interest of the beneficiaries of the scheme.
Professor Blake, you wanted to come in briefly?
Yes, so very, very briefly, just for a point of information, there have been a number of reports on investment governance or the structure of investments in local authority pension schemes, some of which have been commissioned by Scottish local authorities, and some of these reports have not yet been put into the public domain. We did something very recently, a few weeks ago, on looking at the London schemes, and I'm happy to, this is on the Pensions Institute website, I'm happy to leave a copy of this report for you about the issues of investment governance in the London local authority schemes, and there are major problems, and it could be improved. One of them was mentioned about the short-term nature of the councillors who are quasi-trustees, and they're not there to be. They were there to improve social amenities, and they're ending up requiring to put more money into the pension scheme, and their advisors are trying to find ways of kicking the can down the road and delaying this happening. So this is something that you might want to take into account as well as a point of information.
Thank you, Professor Blake. John, you wanted to...
Yes, just to come back and clear Scott's point. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think it was Manchester perhaps, put aside part of its, say, property portfolio or whatever into specifically Manchester or that area investments. And I think there was a problem for councillors because we were being told, oh, you've got to invest, you know, get the best possible return, the fiduciary side. But if we'd actually asked the people who were going to get the pensions, do you want us to invest in Glasgow or in London, they'd have all have said Glasgow.
Okay, a few people wanting to come in, but I'll try and stick to the kind of path because there's folk who've been asking to come in for the last few minutes. So Angela, to followed by Professor Bell, and then Dave Watson.
Thanks, Convener. Just to clarify something that Dave Watson said, I'm obviously not being very articulate this morning. We weren't suggesting that all of the schemes should be the same. What we were suggesting was there were variances in them, and it was to be clear about what the rationale was for those differences amongst the schemes. So, for example, for teachers, police and fire, the average working life of teachers, police officers and firefighters is quite long compared to NHS and local government workers, but the average pension in those three different schemes are quite different. So just to clarify that we weren't suggesting they were all the same. Obviously, they need to meet the needs of the different types of employees, but a clear rationale for why they're different so that people can understand why one scheme is different to another scheme.
Thank you. Professor Bell?
I'd just like to make firstly the observation that I'm not the only person who's used the phrase intergenerational equity in the committee, so that's good. Just one very simple point. I mean, the issues we're talking about are very, very complex, and we talk often about our role in encouraging preventative spend. One of the key issues, it seems to me, which we probably don't address very well in Scotland, that is financial literacy. And maybe we ought to be thinking a great deal about, because these are such important issues, trying to extend the understanding of the complexity of these issues to all generations, in fact. So, and it covers a lot of other areas, things like payday loans as well at the moment. But financial literacy should, I think, have a much higher priority than it does at present.
Sorry, Dave.
Return to the issue of the investment. I mean, I think we should be aware that the local government scheme is the only one that's funded that actually has money for investment, whereas the others are pay-as-you-go schemes. With local government scheme, we're talking about £20 billion in Scotland on that basis. Now, that's a huge amount of money in terms of investment. And I think John rightly put it. You know, if we ask our members, then would they prefer to see money invested in the Tokyo Underground or housing in Glasgow? Then it's a no-brainer. And yes, we have invested. One scheme did invest in the Tokyo Underground, and that's the sort of choices there. And I think Claire's exactly right to highlight some of the difficulties in tackling some of these issues. We've been doing quite a lot of work on this, and we will be publishing a paper very shortly on housing investment using local government pension scheme, because we've been working with housing associations and others in working up a scheme. How we might do that, and we're not alone in that. John mentioned the Manchester scheme, where there's some work done there. The REBA have published a report called Future Homes, and they highlighted this issue as well. And the John Smith Institute's done some work as well on that area. So there is a number of areas in terms of that. There is an issue around governance. Sometimes government ministers do pop up at conferences and say, wouldn't it be nice if we make more use of the 20 billion on that basis? If I'm at that conference, I usually pop up and remind them it's not their money. And if our members thought the government ministers were directing that, then they might take a different view of that investment. So there is an issue here, but I think that's an issue of governance. And I think one of the ways we get around, Lord Hutton talked about strengthening governance, certainly in the pay-as-you-go schemes, but local governance isn't good either. In our view, it's contrary to what's called the IORP directive, which is a European directive on pensions governance, and needs to be strengthened. One of the advantages of strengthening the governance by that I mean essentially better involvement of the members of the scheme as well as just councillors who predominantly make all decisions at the moment. And pension funds in Scotland have started to move in this direction, but we can go further. One of the beauties of that is you do get that broader view of pension investment and how we might use it. And therefore, we think there's a big opportunity there. It gets around the political interference issue because essentially this would be a more broader representative pension fund making those decisions in similar ways we do in our big private sector schemes. And it is perfectly possible to invest in socially useful things. Private sector funds that I'm involved in have ethical investment policies. It doesn't reduce the income coming into those funds on that basis. But you've got to get the right mix, and I agree with Claire, we've got to get the right mix of balance between the property, the equities and other arrangements to ensure we get the same rate of return. But I do think there's an issue about switching investment more to things which and to be honest, I've said often to Claire and colleagues that people don't understand the number of things that pension funds in Scotland actually do own. I would put EU-type little signs on buildings that are owned by local government pension schemes in Scotland to demonstrate the value and that it brings to the Scottish economy of pension investment, taking Professor Blake's point. People are investing in pensions, but that money is being invested in the economy. So, and of course, when they retire, that's revenue spending in the economy, which is very important as well. So it's a win-win all round. And I think we can tackle the governance issues and get round some of the issues which are of concern to Claire and her colleagues who have to manage the funds.
Thank you. Now, no one has actually asked to speak at this point, and we're just over 65 minutes into the session. And I said it would be about 75. So what I want to do now is give everyone an opportunity to make any final points on an issue which has either been raised or has not been raised so far. I just want to know who wishes to be first. I'm just going to keep staring at you until Claire.
Just one small point around encouraging saving for retirement and pensions. At the moment, the benefit system is a disincentive to saving because if people do have a pension, then they lose benefits. So there is it needs to be considered in totality.
Thank you. Anyone else with any final comment? Dave?
Just one short point that I didn't make earlier, which was on the migration point. I think there's some positives there as well that I'm not entirely, convinced the very high-paid French and Germans popping into the City of London are entirely relevant to us. But there is an issue about migration, and that is a positive because one of the advantages of inward migration into Scotland is they are generally younger people, and that does give us a better balance. Scotland's population is increasing for the last number of years, first time for a generation, and that's sadly not because of the American birth rate issue, it's because of migration to Scotland. That is a good thing in terms of getting this balance right in the population so we don't get a continually elderly population, and something we ought to recognise as well.
Yes, I mean the figures we had at one of the previous meetings was that the UK's predicted populations predicted to increase from 61 to 79 million by 2050. Germany is going to go in exactly the opposite direction, falling from 83 to about 63 million. So there is an issue. Of course, when migrants get older, then they have to be looked after. So it may be that the issue is just effectively been postponed a generation or two. Ultimately, the crunch will come at some point. Yes, Angela.
I think just picking up on some of the points that have been made earlier about intergenerational. I mean, pensions are a long-term issue. The quick fixes are going to be difficult. You're talking about the timescale's long, up to 60 years or more through your working life and your pension, your retirement. So employees today could be still drawing their pension in 2070. So it's just worth thinking about. It's in the very long term we're talking about. So we need to think about when we're making policy decisions and thinking about the financial sustainability. It's not just now and in the current recession, it's the next couple of generations.
Professor Blake, do you have any further final comments you wish to make? No?
I'm fine, thank you.
You're quite happy. To rest, Dave?
I've been quite quiet today, but I'm quite happy.
Okay. Well, we actually opened the session with our own advisor to the committee, Professor Bell. I don't know, Professor Bell, if you have anything further you want to add since you opened the session.
I've started to do some work on the state old age pension and how that will look into the future in Scotland. And actually, over the next 10 years, if I can introduce a note of qualified optimism, it's not going to increase as a share of GDP. Nevertheless, the flip side of that is that it's not terribly generous, the state pension, and anything that we can do. I am struck, although it adds to complexity, that you really don't want the low paid to be subsidising the pensions of the better off in society, and if we can organise our system, which adds to its complexity, to ensure that doesn't happen, then that would also certainly be a benefit.
So you're suggesting, for example, that say a lower paid workers maybe make a 5% contribution, higher paid workers a 10 or a 15% contribution. Is that kind of
well? In relation to their again, you start to separate out risks, which means that there's less pooling of risk. But clearly the point is very well made that many people in the west of Scotland will contribute to a pension and not get anything out of it, because life expectancy is so much shorter. Literally 12 years difference in average life expectancy across 6 commuter stations in Glasgow. So there are differences within the west of Scotland, but some of the areas of low life expectancy there are among the most extreme areas in Europe. Even the accession countries, whatever.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Professor Bell, and thank you to all our guests this morning. It's been a very interesting and stimulating discussion. We have obviously quite a substantial agenda ahead of us, so I'd like to call a natural break until 11:25. Everyone, we shall begin again the session with our third item of business, which is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the High Hedges Scotland Bill's financial memorandum. So can I welcome to the meeting Mark MacDonald, MSP, back to his old stomping ground on the Finance Committee, albeit in the hot seat today, who's in charge of the bill, and accompanying him are John Brownlee and Jerry McLaughlin from the Scottish Government Bill team. I'm just wondering, Mark, if you have a brief opening statement?
No opening statement, Convener. We'll just go straight to questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll obviously start off myself with questions, which obviously are on the financial memorandum specifically. We've had a number of issues raised with us in terms of local authorities, in terms of the local authority being able to fix different levels of fees. I'm just wondering if you can tell us what your thinking is behind that, Mark.
Sorry, could you just repeat that, Convener?
Sorry, it's just that some local authorities have raised concerns about the ability to fix different levels of fees for different applications or types of applications. I'm just wondering what your thinking is in terms of having flexibility with local authorities in terms of the fixing of fees on applications.
Sure. I mean, obviously, as part of the initial stages of putting forward this bill, I consulted with local authorities in England and Wales who have obviously had legislation enacted in their area, and there was evidence there that the fee level did vary from authority to authority, and it's based on the authority's own calculation in terms of the costs that they would incur in terms of enforcing the legislation, and that will potentially vary from authority to authority depending on, you know, the rate of pay, for example, for individual officers, the number of officers who might be involved, and other factors that might be included. So I've tried to encapsulate a sort of broad range of where I see the fee levels would perhaps sit, but it's not prescriptive in any sense.
And the level of fee, there will be some people who will have an issue with High Hedges, but may find this fee a bit onerous, don't you think?
Well, undoubtedly there will be some people who will view a cost to access to dispute resolution as being difficult to bear. Again, I would simply reiterate that the bill is essentially an enabling bill, and the powers are there for local authorities to use. So it will be for a local authority to decide, firstly, what the fee it charges is, and then secondly, how they wish to administer that fee. Now, it may be that local authorities would choose to offer a discounted rate to pensioners, for example. They may choose to offer the ability for the fee to be paid in stages as opposed to all in one go at the beginning. It's really for local authorities to determine and decide what the best way to ensure that, firstly, the effects of the bill are cost neutral to them, and secondly, that they don't put in place unnecessary or unjustifiable barriers to people accessing the process.
I think the issue is, of course, that some local authorities don't believe it is cost neutral. For example, Angus say, and I quote, "There is no recognition of the cost to authorities of serving, monitoring and enforcing notices."
Sure, and I know a number of the authorities here are saying that, and you know, the financial memorandum is indicative. It's not prescriptive, and if local authorities themselves consider that there are other costs that need to be factored in, then obviously that's a decision for them to take as part of their fee-setting process, and undoubtedly elected members at local authority level will have to, you know, deal with reports that come before their committees, which will say, here is the cost and here's why we believe that cost is there. I mean, if we look at sort of the principle I tried to use when looking at the fee-setting issue, because I wanted to be clear that this was about essentially washing its face in terms of the costs. I looked at House of Multiple Occupation legislation, which, as you'll know, the regulations for that are very clear that the licence fees that are raised from HMO licences must be used to cover the administrative costs, and they can't be used as a revenue-raising mechanism. So I wanted to approach it from that sort of principle, and the fees that are in here are the indicative fees that are in here come as a result of discussions with local authorities both in Scotland and in England and Wales. Now, there may be some local authorities who will consider that they have particular difficulties or particular individual circumstances that have not been captured within that. That doesn't mean to say that they won't be free to factor that in when they come to set their fee.
I don't think anyone who's submitted any responses to us have said it will be revenue neutral. They all seem to think it will create an additional burden for local authorities. For example, East Renfrewshire, when asked, do you believe that financial implications have been accurately reflected in the financial memorandum, they've said no, the bill cannot do other than increase the staff time and resources involved, and the more protracted inquiries are likely to entail legal costs, including time and title searches. And they've also went on to add that when asked what other costs might be incurred, they've said additional training, staff equipment and legal costs for pursuing people who may just simply refuse to pay or may be difficult to trace, because certainly in my constituency, where I've got about 37 of these cases kind of on hold, if you like, some of the owners have just cannot be traced. I mean, nobody seems to know who owns these. I have to say, though, of course, before you respond, North Lanarkshire Council have said in defence that the proposal does administration costs of up to £500 look adequate, considering there is no current charge for any time spent in this currently. So I don't want to give the impression that everyone is being negative in this, but clearly, obviously, there are concerns by some people, and even though South Lanarkshire Council wasn't as opposed as East Renfrewshire, who think they'll have a disproportionate number of cases, they've also said that the proposal doesn't take account of the cost of dealing with inquiries to local authorities.
Sure. I mean, I was on the Sunday Politics show on Sunday, and there was a comment there from Vincent Waters, the environment convener of East Renfrewshire Council, who said, firstly, that East Renfrewshire Council welcomes the bill and also believes that there will be a drastic drop in the number of complaints, and most of the complaints will drop to what he referred to as a tiny trickle. So the local authority, from the elected member perspective, certainly seem to think that this will be helpful. I mean, if we look, I think the English example does bear some scrutiny in terms of perhaps giving us an indication of where this is likely to go. If we take, for example, Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, which you would expect to be quite a leafy area where perhaps hedges might be more in prevalence. Initially, they had 300 plus inquiries when the legislation first came into effect. In the period 2005 to 2011, they've had 20 formal applications to have disputes adjudicated on, and the number of times where the council has had to take enforcement action is 0. The council has not had to go in and take enforcement action. Where enforcement notices are dealt, they are complied with by the owners, and that bears witness throughout almost all of the local authorities. South Tyneside has had one case where they've had to take enforcement action, but beyond that, the local authorities who we spoke to and who are listed in the financial memorandum have given no evidence of cases where they've had to go in and take action, although that obviously is an option within the legislation. It seems clear from the evidence south of the border that that doesn't happen as standard practice.
Just one final point before I open it out to colleagues. In paragraph 81 of the financial memorandum, it says that the costs will ultimately fall on those involved in the dispute, both the applicant and the hedge owner. If someone, I think this will cause some concerns. For some people, take the view that, well, my next door neighbour has just unilaterally decided to allow his hedge to grow 20 feet high in front of my windows, and yet I've got to pay £400 or £500 possibly, to get the council to actually, pursue him to get that hedge cut. Would it not be better if someone, say for example, the person who has grown this hedge decided not to participate in dispute mechanism, etc., for them to then have to refund the cost of the application to someone? Because it seems that whether you're innocent or guilty, if you want to use those expressions in this, you're still going to be out of pocket. So if my next door neighbour decides to grow a hedge, I've got to pay a few £100 to get it cut, even though, there's a kind of element of fairness there, I think, which is absent.
I think there's a complexity that gets involved if we do that, convener. If we look at, for example, let's just take a made-up example where two individuals living next door to each other, there is a hedge that is part of a dispute. If neighbour A applies and says, I want neighbour B's hedge to be dealt with, the local authority agrees, serves a remedial notice, and neighbour B then complies with that and gets the work done, the local authority is not having to recover any costs in terms of hedge maintenance or hedge lopping, but they would then be having to pursue costs of a few £100 as opposed to a few £1,000, which would perhaps be a more cost-effective use of time to pursue such costs. So I would be wary of getting into a situation where councils are in a position where they might have to pursue costs of a couple of £100 simply because we've decided that the burden of the fee should shift.
The opposite of that is if I'm sitting with a big hedge 20 feet and I don't want to get it cut, I'll just say, well, my next door neighbour's a pensioner, can I afford a £500 application, and I'll not have to refund the money. Whereas if they did have to refund the money, they might say, right, I don't want this to go to the council. You know, ultimately I'm going to have to cut this down, I may as well do it now, and that avoids this entire process having to be, you know, taken forward.
Indeed, well, I mean, the thing to bear in mind is that the vast majority of cases are probably going to deal with themselves once the legislation comes into effect, and the evidence from south of the border would indicate that the vast bulk of cases are dealt with once legislation comes into effect without the need to go to a formal complaint. There will be those small number of intractable cases which will have to go to some form of adjudication. And I think, you know, I made it clear that it is for local authorities to determine what they do in terms of the fees, how they structure those fees, what discounts, if any, they decide to offer depending on an individual circumstances, or whether they offer payment by stage process in order to allow for people to have that access. And I think the bottom line is that if I were a local councillor whose local authority was responsible for administering this scheme, and I was getting complaints from constituents that they couldn't afford to access the process, then I would be looking at ways in which my local authority could make it more affordable for people to access the process. So the bill is an enabling bill. It gives the power to local authorities, and I think that they will look very carefully at how they ensure that they both deal with the situations that will arise, but also do not unnecessarily prevent people from accessing the process.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it out now to questions from the committee, and the first to ask a question will be the Deputy Convener, followed by Jamie.
Well, the Convener has grabbed so many of the obvious questions that the rest of us are probably struggling, but going back to the point, I mean, it struck me as quite a different response from East Renfrewshire and North Lanarkshire. And of course, in our minds, I know they're both mixed areas, but many of us might think that East Renfrewshire was a kind of better off area and more disputes, and North Lanarkshire kind of the opposite. Do you think it is going to be patchy across the country? And you know, I hate the term postcode lottery, but that you know, could kind of be used in this, that it is going to be quite different around the country?
I think we will see variations from local authority to local authority. Obviously, I can't imagine there are going to be too many needs for complaint in places like Orkney and Shetland, for example, but nonetheless, there will be variations depending on the circumstances within a local authority area, and the evidence that Scott Hedge, the campaign group, have brought forward would indicate that there are some local authority areas which are more prevalent in terms of complaints generated.
Now, you said the individual local authority would have freedom to kind of come up with its own charging regime. So, for example, one local authority could say, well, the average cost is 300, so everybody pays 300. But another one could say, well, the average cost is 300, but we'll charge some people 200 and some people 400, depending on the circumstances. Would that actually be possible under the...
Well, the evidence that we have from down south is that it's one charge that is levied. I wouldn't imagine local authorities would look to charge people different fees based on the individual case. I wouldn't expect that to happen.
The argument has been that poorer people might not be able to afford this. So if a council, say, wanted to help poorer people, that would mean charging better off people more?
No, but it doesn't necessarily mean charging better off people more than the fee that they set. What it means is looking at ways in which the fees can be charged. They may wish to offer a discount to those who demonstrate an inability to pay. That's not the same as saying there is a higher fee above the standard fee. They may also want to look at ways in which they could stage the payment. I'm not being prescriptive to local authorities and how they levy the fees. I think it would be difficult if we got into the case of you know, charging higher and lower fees as a standard.
Okay. And my final point was, I mean, the suggestion has been made by some of them that you know, the kind of investigative process and finding out who the owners are could take ages and therefore cost a lot of money. I mean, presumably in some cases it would be just cheaper for the council if they can't find the owner to just go in and cut down the hedge.
Well, again, I look to the evidence from south of the border where the number of times that a council has had to go in to take enforcement action because it has not been taken by the owner of a hedge are minuscule. In terms of the example that you're stating, there is still going to be a need for the local authority to recover its cost, whether or not it chooses to remove a hedge or otherwise. I think the evidence from professionals in terms of tree officers would be that they would not advise complete removal of a hedge as being the approach that was taken, but there would still be a need for a local authority to find ways to recover its costs. But I think the number of cases where the local authority is going to go in and have to take the action itself are probably going to be virtually nil.
Okay, thank you.
Jamie, to follow by Gavin.
Thank you, Convener. I have to say the possibility of this provides me to ask some searching questions. My good friend Mr MacDonald is too good to pass up, so I'm very delighted to have this opportunity. I want to turn to the part, and I was intrigued that you'd been in discussion with NATO on these matters until I realised it was the National Association of Tree Officers. Yeah, I want to look at the evidence you've gathered from England. The fees seem to vary quite a lot between the local authority areas you've identified. I mean, I see Sandwell has no fee for applications. The Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, it has fees of £600. Now, clearly, where there's no fee, they've just decided to soak up. But the lowest fee for those levying a charge, Hartlepool, £150. I mean, I can't understand why the cost differential would be so much in cutting down hedges. Have you got any evidence as to explain that variance?
Well, the test that I've put into the legislation around costs being covered isn't necessarily in place in England. We took evidence from a number of authorities. We spoke to officers at Hartlepool and at South Tyneside Council. One of the points that was made was that at the time the legislation was introduced, a number of authorities put adverts out for high hedge officers before realising that such a post wasn't required because it could be comfortably dealt with within the job of the current tree officers or arboriculturalists within the local authority area. There is some evidence that there has been a use of fees to deter frivolous complaints. I'm not wanting to put that in place in the legislation. The legislation should be about resolving disputes and ensuring that local authorities don't have to basically bear the cost of that, because we obviously live in times where budgets are tight, and even though we may only be talking about small costs, it still would be an unrecovered cost to the authority. So while the fee levels down there have varied quite widely, I think that what you would see in a situation where the mechanism is there to ensure that costs are covered only by costs are covered by the fee, is that you wouldn't see quite such wide variations, I would imagine.
Yeah, I have to say, if there'd been a high hedge officer, I think there'd be a scoosh case as a job, given the number of that, which could have had one for the whole of England. I mean, that brings me on to my next question, because, and I think you've more or less answered this, but I'll just eke it out. Absolutely. It sounds to me as though what you're saying, the legislation in England essentially allows councils to run this as a revenue-raising scheme where they get an application. That's not the case here. That it will be framed in such a way that essentially they can only recover the costs. They can't decide to make additional funds off the back of it.
Yeah, I mean, the legislation says that a fee paid to an authority may be refunded by it in such circumstances as it may determine if it wants to, but also it must not exceed an amount which it considers represents the reasonable cost of authority in deciding an application. So you can't charge more than it would cost you to deal with the case. I think it's worth saying, however, that you know, based on the evidence from south of the border, and if we were to extrapolate that in terms of the number of cases we might see in Scotland, I think it would be a very unwise local authority that tried to use this as any kind of revenue-raising mechanism, because the evidence from south of the border is you get an initial flurry of inquiries, that then reduces to a very, very small number of complaints as time goes by. So to try and use it to raise revenue, I don't think would be a wise move for any local authority to do.
Yes, I don't suppose this would plug the funding gap they're talking of, but I mean, I was actually surprised at how few applications there have been. It's also interesting, I think, to notice that the cost levied doesn't actually seem to influence the amount of applications. I see here where there's been no fee, there's actually been less where it's that the fee is the highest of the list you've provided. Are you expecting on a proportionate basis, a similar number of applications over a similar time frame in Scotland? Do we have any evidence as to how many applications are likely?
We do have some anecdotal evidence, which I don't have in front of me, but I'd be happy to write to the committee after the meeting with some evidence, unless either of my colleagues have that off the top of their head, the numbers. Jerry, do you want to?
Yeah. Sorry, the local government committee were taking evidence from tree officers before we came here, and they were asked the same question, and their kind of rough estimate was maybe a dozen cases for their local authority area was the kind of numbers that they were anticipating.
We can certainly provide the committee with evidence in terms of the number of cases that, for example, Scott Hedge have indicated they're dealing with, which might give a rough indication of the numbers at the initial stage, and then what that might look like going forward. So we can certainly put something together and submit it to the committee if you would like that.
As I mentioned earlier, I've got 37 cases, but only 12 of those are known to Scott Hedge, because I spoke to him and we compared the kind of list, so that might just be tip of the iceberg. But of course, the cases, as you said, there'll be a big flurry at the beginning, but it's what they are in terms of going forward, I think, is the issue. Gavin, to be followed by Jean. Oh, sorry.
A couple of questions, is that okay? No, just to pick up on what you'd said earlier about the cost, because I understand what you were saying, Kim, in terms of the cost might, it might be felt that would put folk off. Was there any investigation of capping the fees?
We did look at the evidence. Wales has a fee cap, and the evidence is that basically when you have a fee cap, everybody just charges the maximum, or the majority of people charge the maximum that they can charge. And it doesn't take account, therefore, of the ability to cover costs. It's just basically what's the most we can charge, let's charge that. So we looked at the fee cap, but we're not convinced that capping fees would necessarily provide the level of protection that you might consider it would.
I have another two quick questions. That's okay, Kim. This issue of recovering the costs from the owner, I mean, it's clear that it's not been a big issue, but it could be an issue, and I think the Deputy Convener identified the circumstances where it could be an issue. You know, say you can't find the owner. You know, what are the mechanisms available to local authorities through this legislation where they're struggling to recover the costs? Do you think this is going to be a big problem?
I don't anticipate it being a huge problem, but obviously we have to factor in that it might happen. There are a number of options that are open to local authorities. There is obviously the use of the courts to pursue a cost, and then obviously costs would be recovered not just for the work undertaken, but also legal costs. There's also the option of attaching a land debt to a property, where that debt sits on the property and must be repaid at the point at which the property is sold, or the person vacates the property. So there are those options available. Those are options that have been available to authorities in England as well. So those are the kind of options that local authorities can look at in ways in which they could recover costs.
I just find that interesting because in my experience, where I don't have as many cases as you, Convener, but in my experience where this is an issue, it is actually where they don't know where the owner of the adjacent property is, and that's the problem. One final question, I know I've asked a few, but in terms of, there's obviously a provision for an appeal to the Scottish Minister and a cost associated with that to the Scottish Government, and you set out what the costs are very usefully. I just want to clarify, is that both parties have the right of appeal?
That's correct.
Okay.
You just don't have all the lovely sea views in your constituency that I do, which is actually a real issue.
Very nice.
Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Jean.
Yeah, thank you. I want to explore an issue raised by South Lanarkshire Council in their written evidence to this committee. What is your view on the High Hedges fee transfer regulations Northern Ireland 2012?
I'll be honest, I don't know enough of the fee transfer regulations in Northern Ireland in detail at present. My colleagues might be able to assist me in that respect in terms of what they look at.
Yeah, I'd certainly be happy to comment. I mean, we're certainly aware of the existence of the fee transfer mechanism, whereby the person who has complained has their fee refunded if the case is essentially found against the owner of the hedge. From our most recent discussions with colleagues in Northern Ireland, though, the national body in Northern Ireland doesn't have any information as to how successful that has been. I mean, you'll be aware that the Northern Ireland legislation is within the UK, it's the most recent legislation. It's passed in 2011. So they don't yet have any information as to how effective or how that's actually worked in practice.
I mean, I've got the regulations here. So the regulations themselves only came into force in March of this year, so after I suppose, the initial high-HEG regulations. But it says on the explanatory note, once the remedial notice takes effect, assuming there are no appeals, the council will refund the complainant's fee, if any has been charged, and may then levy a fee on the owner occupier of the neighbouring land. So it just struck me as something that might deal with the point the convener raised. While it's clearly early days in Northern Ireland, I just wonder if it's something that the member would reflect
I mean, I think
upon.
I gave my initial thoughts in relation to the issue around a fee recovery mechanism. I mean, there is the option, as I outlined in the legislation at the moment, for fees to be refunded or part refunded where the authority deems that necessary. I mean, I'm happy to look at the Northern Irish example. I think we've not got enough evidence yet to go on, but I'm happy to look at that between now and stage 2 and see if that's something that might be applicable within the legislation. But again, I would simply say that I don't want to get into the situation where we have local authorities potentially having to pursue what are fairly low costs at what might be a disproportionate cost burden to the authority itself.
Leave it there. Thank you.
Jane?
Yeah, just a wee thing. Do you see the bill, Mr MacDonald, as coming into force after reasonable investigation of the circumstances? In other words, rather than one neighbour come along expected to pay a fee to ask for this service, that there would be that would be the kind of start of a process if things appeared not to be right, that they would, in the first instance, would the council be expected to write to the neighbour reminding of the act and saying that there's concern?
The initial stages of the process, any individual who applies has to demonstrate that they've taken steps to resolve the dispute through other means, and that could be through, for example, writing to their neighbour. It could be, and we're not explicit about this, but it could be if they've gone through mediation, as some people have. So this is very much the sort of the option of last resort, is to then take an application to the authority. Most authorities, I would expect, would advise people of the fee that would be levied. They would advise them of the process that they have to go through. Indeed, the evidence from south of the border is that there's a checklist that is essentially done, and if people don't meet all of the criteria that need to be met in order for it to hit the application process, then it goes no further, so no fee is charged.
Okay, that appears to have exhausted the questions from the committee. Oh no, Elaine, you have got one.
Because I'm leaving the committee, I've been ignored, you see.
No, you didn't actually. There was no indication that you had asked to speak at any point. You didn't see you. Therefore,
You didn't see me, that's because I'm so short.
Neither of us saw you, actually. Okay, Elaine?
No, actually, I think you've covered most of the point anyway. It was just around the sort of the possibility of the fee transfer, because obviously the legislation in England's been fairly successful. The awareness of the legislation has actually resolved a lot of the issues, and hopefully it would work in a very similar way here. But if somebody actually basically is aware that the legislation is there and has continued not to bother to do anything about their hedge, then it is a little unfair if the complainant, who hasn't been able to get a resolution from the neighbour, ends up being several £100s out of pocket. So I think the possibility, if you would look at the possibility of the Northern Ireland example, would be maybe give an extra impetus for people actually to...
I'm happy to do so. Obviously, the Northern Irish example doesn't yet have maybe the weight of evidence behind it due to it being still in its infancy. But I think it would just be worth putting on record as well that not every case that goes to a complaint will find in favour of the complainant. So there will be people who will pay an application fee and go through the process, and the case will not be found in their favour. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well, because I often get accused by some of this being a bill that is entirely anti-hedge. It's not. It's about resolving dispute, first and foremost. And there will be some cases where the dispute will not be resolved in favour of the complainant. So it's worth maybe bearing that in mind as well when we look at this process.
I've got one of those cases actually. Well, if they feel that the neighbours have made raised a spurious complaint, so I appreciate your comments on that. Just one last thing I was going to ask you, Mark, which was basically in response to your answer about cost neutrality to John. You basically said that you know, the council may decide to actually reduce the fee for people or pensioners, etc. But if they do that and they don't, you said they wouldn't put the fee up for other people, then how can it be cost neutral? Because the local authority would be out of pocket in that case.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I say, I probably didn't explain myself very well at that point. But it is for local authorities to decide what is the fee that they will charge that will deal with the caseload that they will face. Now, obviously, there will be some cases which will be more difficult to assess, because each case will have to be assessed on its individual merits. So I'm not suggesting that the fee would necessarily capture every single case. It will probably be an average aggregation of you know, what is the average amount of time that is going to be spent. So there will be variations within that. So it may be that, for example, taking the approach that I had suggested will still allow it to be a cost neutral method, but that's for local authorities to determine.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. If there are no further questions, we'd like to thank you for coming along today, so thank you. Are members content for me to write to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee attaching a copy of the official report of today's discussion and the submissions that we've received? Yep. Okay, thank you very much. At the beginning of the meeting, the committee agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore close the public meeting and just have a couple of minutes to allow the public and official report to leave.